The morning Sophie Briggs wrote the letter, the kitchen smelled like burnt toast and the particular kind of quiet that settles into a house when someone inside it is very sick. She was 8 years old and she sat at the kitchen table with her backpack still on because she had come home from school the same way she did every Tuesday, quietly with her sneakers squeaking on the linoleum and her eyes going first to the hallway, checking for the strip of light beneath her grandmother's door. If the light was on, Grandma was awake. If it was off, she was resting, which happened more and more these days, and which Sophie had learned not to take as a bad sign, because if she started treating it as a bad sign, the worry became too large to carry around inside a school day. The light was off. Sophie set her backpack down gently against the table leg and pulled out her homework folder. Inside it, folded in half, was the assignment her teacher, Mrs. Calloway, had given the class that afternoon. A single sheet of lined paper with a header printed at the top in a blue border. A letter to anyone in the world. Mrs. Calloway had explained it during the last 10 minutes of the school day, standing at the front of the room in her yellow cardigan, with her hands clasped the way she clasped them when she was excited about something. You could write to a president, she said, a scientist, an astronaut, a famous athlete, an author, anyone at all. The only rule was that the letter had to be genuine. It had to say something true. Sophie had sat at her desk and looked at the blank page and thought about it for the entire bus ride home. She thought about her grandmother. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Nora Briggs was 67 years old and had lived in the same house on Callaway Creek Road in Harlan County, Kentucky, for 41 years. She was not a woman who made a large footprint in the world. She had never wanted to. She had raised one daughter and buried one husband, and planted the same garden every spring without fail. Tomatoes along the south fence, marigolds at the corners to keep the deer away, one row of sunflowers along the back wall that she grew, she always said, not because they were useful, but because they reminded her that some things grew tall simply because they were meant to. Her daughter, Diane, was 31 years old and worked two jobs in the way that people work two jobs when there is no alternative available and no one coming to offer one. Monday through Friday, she cleaned rooms at the Mountain View Motor Lodge on Route 119 from 6 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon, then drove 20 minutes to her second job at a grocery distribution warehouse, where she unloaded pallets from 5 until midnight. She did this 5 days a week. On Saturdays, she cleaned houses for 3 families in the nicer part of town. On Sundays, if the schedule allowed, she slept until 8 and cooked a proper meal and tried to be a mother in the way she wanted to be, which was fully, and which the other 6 days of the week made very difficult. She had come home to her mother's house 18 months ago when the diagnosis arrived. Congestive heart failure. The cardiologist had said the words in a room that smelled like antiseptic and industrial carpet cleaner, and Diane had written them down on the back of an insurance form because her phone was dead and she had nothing else to write on, and she had read them back to herself in the parking lot, standing beside her car for a long time before she felt able to drive. Before the diagnosis, Diane and Sophie had been living in Lexington in a one-bedroom apartment near the community college, where Diane had been taking nursing prerequisite courses 2 nights a week for the past year and a half. The apartment was small and the neighborhood was loud on weekend nights, and the commute to Sophie's school was 40 minutes each way by bus. But Diane had assembled it carefully from nothing, and it had been theirs. And the nursing program had felt like a door that was slowly, genuinely opening in her direction. She had deferred her enrollment, the same way you do things when the choice has already been made for you, and you are simply acknowledging what has happened. She had packed their 2 rooms into a borrowed truck and come home, and she had not talked about the nursing program since. Not to her mother, not to Sophie, not to anyone who might look at her with the particular expression of someone who thought she was making a sacrifice. She did not think of it as a sacrifice. She thought of it as what it was. The house on Callaway Creek Road was what Diane called a house that holds together by memory and habit. The gutters needed replacing. Well, now one of the bathroom windows had a crack sealed with electrical tape that had been there since before Sophie was born. The furnace made a sound on cold mornings that Diane could not identify and had learned to live with. The back porch had a soft spot near the door that you stepped around automatically after a while, the way you learn the particular language of a place that has been lived in a long time. Nora's medical bills had arrived in a slow, patient stack over the first 6 months. Cardiologist appointments, specialist consultations, the 3-day hospital stay in March when her fluid levels had required monitoring, the echocardiogram, the medication adjustments that came with their own separate billing codes. Diane kept them in a manila envelope in the kitchen drawer beneath the dish towels, and she went through them on Sunday evenings after Sophie was in bed with a pencil and a legal pad, working out what could be deferred and what could not, and what was already past the point of deferring. The envelope had gotten thick. The total, as of the last time Diane had allowed herself to look at it directly, had climbed past $19,000. This was after the insurance had processed what it processed and denied what it denied, which had been more than Diane had expected and less than she had feared, which in the mathematics of medical debt was about the best you could hope for. Sophie knew, in the way that children know things that adults believe they have successfully hidden, that things were hard. Not because anyone had explained the numbers to her, but because she had the particular attentiveness of a child who grew up in a quiet house with a sick grandmother and a mother who hummed to herself when she was trying not to worry. The humming was the tell. Diane hummed old hymns under her breath when she was doing the dishes, when she was folding laundry, when she was sitting at the kitchen table going through the envelope beneath the dish towels. And Sophie, lying awake in her room down the hall, heard it the way you hear something you have come to associate with a specific feeling. She loved her grandmother with a completeness that was not sentimental or performed. It was simply structural. The way the house was structural, the way the sunflowers along the back wall were structural. Nora Briggs was the person who had taught Sophie to read before kindergarten using a library copy of Charlotte's Web and an infinite supply of patience. She was the person who made biscuits from memory every Saturday morning without measuring anything, pressing the dough with the heel of her hand in the way her own mother had done, and her mother before that. She was the person who knew every bird that came to the feeder by the window and called them by name, even the sparrows that most people considered too common to bother with. She was the person who had sat beside Sophie's bed through 3 consecutive nights of fever when Sophie was 5 and had held her hand each time she woke up and said without fail, "I'm right here, baby. I'm not going anywhere." Sophie wanted to help her. She was 8 years old and she had $17 in her bedroom in a ceramic jar shaped like a frog that her grandmother had painted for her 2 Christmases ago. She had thought in the way that 8-year-olds think about large problems, about whether $17 could help. She had stood in front of the frog jar for a long time one evening and concluded that it could not, and that conclusion had settled into her chest as a specific kind of helplessness that she did not have a name for yet, but would recognize again later in life and understand better then. The assignment came on a Tuesday in October. A letter to anyone in the world. Sophie sat at the kitchen table with the lined paper in front of her, and the house quiet around her, and the strip of light absent beneath her grandmother's door. She picked up her pencil. She chewed the eraser for a moment, which was a habit her mother had asked her to stop, and which she reverted to automatically when she was thinking hard. She smoothed the paper flat with her palm. She did not write to a president. She did not write to a scientist or an astronaut or an author, though she liked books more than almost anything. She wrote to the richest man in the world. She had learned about him 3 weeks ago. not intentionally, but in the way children absorb information from the background noise of adult life. She had been doing homework at the kitchen table when the evening news came on, and her mother had paused in the doorway with the dish towel in her hands and watched for a moment, and the man on the screen had been tall and composed, speaking at a lectern in a large room filled with people who were writing things down. The news anchor had called him the wealthiest private individual on the planet for the third consecutive year. Her mother had made a small sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite something else, and turned back toward the kitchen. Sophie had looked at the screen. The man's name was Cole Whitmore. He was 54 years old, the founder of a technology company called Whitmore Systems that had started, according to the news segment, in a garage in Raleigh, North Carolina in 1994, and had grown into something that now operated in 40 countries and employed over 200,000 people. He had a face that was not unkind, Sophie had thought, watching him speak. He had gray at his temples and glasses he didn't seem entirely comfortable wearing, and a way of standing at the lectern that suggested he would rather be somewhere else, which she found oddly reassuring. She had not thought about him again after that evening, until Tuesday. She pressed her pencil to the paper. She wrote slowly, in the careful cursive she had been practicing since September. The letters formed with deliberate attention, each one sitting neatly on the line. Dear Mr. Richest Man in the World. She paused. Her mother had always said to address people properly. She crossed out the first line. Dear Mr. Cole Whitmore. Better. My name is Sophie Briggs. I am 8 years old. I live in Harlan County, Kentucky with my mom Diane and my grandma Nora. I am writing to you because my teacher said I could write to anyone in the world, and I thought about it for a long time, and I decided I should write to you. She paused again, reading back what she had written. It seemed acceptable so far. My grandma's sick. She has something wrong with her heart. She has to go to the doctor a lot and take many medicines, and she gets very tired now. And she used to not get tired. She used to walk all the way down to the creek with me, and we would look for interesting rocks, and she knew the names of all the birds. She still knows the bird names, but she cannot walk to the creek anymore. Sophie stopped. Her throat felt the way it sometimes felt when she thought about the creek and the rocks, and the fact that they had not gone there since last spring. She breathed in through her nose, or in the way her mother had shown her when feelings became too large for the inside of your body. She kept writing. My mom works very hard to pay for the doctor bills. She works 2 jobs, and sometimes I don't see her until very late, because she has the night job too. She is tired when she comes home, but she always checks on me before she goes to sleep. She always comes in and fixes my blanket even when I am already asleep. I know because I can feel it. I don't know how money works exactly, but I know my mom is worried about paying for everything. I heard her on the phone with the hospital people one night. I was not trying to listen. I just woke up, and I could hear her in the kitchen using her quiet voice, which is the voice she uses when something is serious. I have $17 in a frog jar that my grandma painted for me. I know that is not enough to help with the doctor bills. I know you have a lot of money because the TV said so. I was thinking maybe you could help my grandma get the medicine she needs and pay the doctor people so my mom could stop worrying. I think if my mom stopped worrying about the money part, she could just be with my grandma more, and I think that would be good for both of them. I don't have anything to give you back. I have $17, but I think that is not enough. My grandma makes really good biscuits, and she could teach you if you wanted. Or I could draw you a picture. I am pretty good at drawing birds because my grandma taught me their names, and I practice them. I am sorry if this is not the right way to ask for something. My mom says you should always say sorry if you are not sure you are doing something right. Thank you for reading this letter. I hope you are having a good day. Your friend Sophie Briggs, age 8, Callaway Creek Road, Harlan County, Kentucky. She read it back twice. She added a small drawing of a cardinal in the bottom right corner of the page because cardinals were her grandmother's favorite, and she wanted the letter to have something in it that felt like Nora. She drew it carefully, the crest and the sharp beak in the rounded chest, and she colored it with a red-colored pencil from her school bag, pressing firmly so the color was solid. Then she folded the letter in thirds, the way her grandmother had shown her, and tucked it inside a plain white envelope from the stack her mother kept in the desk drawer. She addressed the envelope in her neatest handwriting, Mr. and Cole Whitmore, the richest man in the world Whitmore Systems. She stared at it for a moment. She did not know the address of Whitmore Systems. She thought about this. Then she added below the name, North Carolina. I think she sealed the envelope. She put one of the stamps from her mother's book of stamps in the top right corner, pressing it down firmly with her thumb. Her mother kept the stamps in the desk drawer too, and Sophie made a note to herself to tell her mother she had used one because her mother kept track of the stamps. She put the letter in her backpack. She was not certain it would arrive. She knew that addresses were supposed to be specific, and that North Carolina, I think, was probably not specific enough. But she had learned from her grandmother that doing the thing you could do was better than not doing it because you could not do the thing you wished you could do. So she would mail it. And if it arrived, it arrived. And if it did not, she had still written something true, which was what the assignment required. She heard the click of her grandmother's bedroom door. Nora came down the hallway the way she moved now, one hand trailing the wall, not leaning on it heavily, but touching it for reassurance, the way you touch a familiar surface in a dark room. She was dressed in her house dress and her soft slippers, and her white hair was pinned up in the loose way she wore it at home. She looked smaller than she had a year ago. That was the thing that Sophie noticed most when she thought about it honestly, which she tried not to do too often. Her grandmother had always seemed to Sophie like a person who took up the right amount of space in the world, substantial and warm and present. And now there was less of her somehow, as if the illness were slowly negotiating the terms of how much of Nora Briggs got to remain. But her eyes were the same. They were brown and clear, and when she smiled, they creased at the corners in the specific way of someone who has smiled genuinely and often for a very long time. "There's my girl," Nora said, settling carefully into the kitchen chair across from Sophie. "What are you working on?" "A letter," Sophie said. "For school?" "Yes, ma'am." Nora looked at the envelope on the table. "Who'd you write to?" Sophie considered. "A man who might be able to help." Nora studied her granddaughter for a long moment. The way she studied things she found interesting. Then she nodded once with the expression of someone who has decided not to ask follow-up questions. "I made decaf," Sophie said. "It's in the pot." Nora smiled again. "The full version, the one with the creases." "When did you learn to make coffee?" "I've been watching you do it my whole life," Sophie said. Nora reached across the table and put her hand over Sophie's. Her hand was warm and dry, and she held it the way she always held things, fully, without reservation. "Your mother is lucky," Nora said quietly, "to have you." Sophie looked at their hands. She thought about the creak in the rocks. She thought about the cardinal in the bottom right corner of her letter. "I'm lucky too," she said. The letter was mailed the following morning. Sophie had carried it in her backpack to school, and at recess she had gone to Mrs. Calloway's desk, while the other children were outside, and asked if she could put her letter in the school mailbox, which was a blue plastic bin near the office where the secretary processed outgoing mail once a week. Mrs. Calloway had been at her desk grading math worksheets. She looked up at Sophie with the focused attention she gave to children who approached her desk outside of normal class time, which in her experience meant either a problem or something worth paying attention to. "Who'd you write to?" she asked. "Mr. Cole Whitmore," Sophie said. Mrs. Calloway set down her red pen. "The technology CEO?" "The richest man in the world," Sophie said. "The TV said he was." Mrs. Calloway looked at Sophie with an expression that moved through several things quickly, something like amusement, then something more careful, then something that settled into a kind of consideration. "May I read it first?" she asked. Sophie thought about this. The letter felt private, the way things feel private when they contain true things about the people you love. But she also trusted Mrs. Calloway more than she trusted most adults outside her family, because Mrs. Calloway was the kind of teacher who listened completely when you were talking, not waiting for you to finish so she could say what she had already decided, but actually listening, which Sophie had learned by 8 years old was rarer than it should have been. She handed over the envelope. Mrs. Calloway read it. She read it without expression, in the particular way adults read things they are deciding how to feel about, carefully without committing prematurely. Then she read it again more slowly. When she finished, she folded it back into thirds and slid it into the envelope. She set it on her desk. She looked at Sophie. "Does your mother know you wrote this?" she asked. "No, ma'am," Sophie said. "She would feel bad. She doesn't like to think she needs help." Mrs. Calloway was quiet for a moment. "Sophie," she said, "I'd like to help make sure this letter gets to the right place. Would that be all right with you?" Sophie considered it. "Do you know his address?" "I can find it," Mrs. Calloway said. Sophie nodded. "Okay." Then, because her mother had taught her, "Thank you, Mrs. Calloway." "Don't thank me yet," her teacher said. "It might not go anywhere, but it should at least go to the right place." She kept the envelope on her desk through the rest of the school day. After the last bus had gone and the building had gone quiet, she sat at her computer with a cup of tea going cold beside her, and she looked up the corporate address for Whitmore Systems. It was not difficult to find. It was on the official website, listed under Contact Us, and there was a specific address for correspondence directed to the executive offices, which included a notation. Letters and communications for Mr. Whitmore are reviewed by his administrative team. She wrote the full address on a new envelope in her adult handwriting, careful and precise, and then she slid Sophie's original letter inside. She did not add anything, no note, no explanation. Sophie's words did not need an interpreter. She sealed it and set it with her own outgoing mail. She went home that evening and made dinner and did not think about it again for the rest of the week, because she was a third-grade teacher in Harlan County, and she had 24 students and a parent-teacher conference schedule and a curriculum calendar to maintain. And she had learned over 19 years of teaching to release things she had done into the world without waiting on them. Most things you did in good faith went quietly into the unremarkable sea of good faith things and disappeared without ceremony. And that was all right. That was simply how the scale worked. She had done what she could do. Now it would go where it went. Whitmore Systems occupied a 15-story glass building in the Research Triangle area of North Carolina that Cole Whitmore had not personally visited in 14 months, a fact he was mildly aware of and had not resolved to change. He lived primarily in motion, hotels in 4 countries, the apartment in New York where he kept clothes and a coffee machine and not much else, the house in Vermont that his ex-wife had kept in the settlement and where his 2 adult daughters still spent holidays, which meant he did not. He had a talent, which his former chief of staff had once described in a performance review with the term operational genius, and which Cole himself would have described more simply as the ability to see problems before they fully materialized and moved toward them, before they became crises, for being in the correct place at the correct time. What he did not have was the ability to be in a place that felt like home. He had stopped noticing this the way you stop noticing certain kinds of quiet, because the absence of sound is not the same as silence, and the absence of a feeling is not the same as peace. He was scheduled to appear 4 weeks from the day Sophie mailed her letter on a live morning program called American Morning with Greta Parks, which was broadcast from a studio in Midtown Manhattan and drew an average of 4.2 million viewers per episode. He had agreed to the appearance 6 months ago in a moment of what his publicist had described as strategic necessity following a data breach incident that had placed Whitmore Systems in headlines for 10 consecutive days. The appearance was meant to be conciliatory and accessible. Cole was meant to be human. His communications director had sent him a 4-page briefing document on the subject of being human, which Cole had read on a plane to Oslo and found both useful and depressing. The letter arrived at the Whitmore Systems executive offices on a Thursday. It traveled from the mail processing room in the building's basement through the standard sorting system, where it was identified as personal correspondence addressed to Cole Whitmore by name and routed to the executive suite administrative desk on the 14th floor. There it was received by a woman named Patricia Osei, who had been Cole Whitmore's executive administrator for 11 years, and who managed his correspondence with the particular efficiency and discretion of someone who had spent more than a decade at the intersection of enormous power and ordinary human need. Patricia Osei was 43 years old and had grown up in Accra before coming to the United States for graduate school, and had a gift for reading people that she attributed entirely to having grown up in a household with 4 brothers, all of them loud, none of them particularly subtle. She had seen in her 11 years every category of letter that found its way to a man of Cole Whitmore's position. The flattery, the proposals, the grievances, the requests, the occasional genuine thing, which arrived rarely and was distinguishable from the rest in ways she had learned to identify on instinct. She opened Sophie's letter on a Friday afternoon when she was working through the week's personal correspondence stack. She read it again. She set it on the center of her desk and sat back in her chair and looked at it for a moment. Well, the lined notebook paper with the careful cursive handwriting and the red cardinal in the bottom right corner, pressed firmly so the color was solid. Patricia had a daughter. She was 10 years old and slept with a stuffed giraffe and was fiercely opinionated about the correct way to make a peanut butter sandwich. She thought about her daughter briefly, the way you think about the people you love when something reminds you of the specific texture of loving them. Then she thought about the broadcast on Thursday. The American morning appearance was 4 days away. She had already prepared Cole's briefing materials. She had already coordinated with the production team on the segment format, the talking points, the photograph releases. The segment was structured as a conversation between Cole and the host, Greta Parks. It focused primarily on the data breach response and the company's renewed privacy commitments. There was a secondary segment that Greta's team had proposed, which Patricia had noted and filed. A portion of the broadcast where Cole would respond to public letters. It was a soft segment designed to present the human side of a man whose public profile had spent the past several months being associated primarily with the words corporate accountability. The production team had asked for letters from the public. They had a stack of them. Carefully vetted, pre-approved, largely unremarkable. Patricia picked up Sophie's letter. She made a decision. She did not make it quickly because she was not a person who made important decisions quickly. She made it after thinking through the implications clearly, which took approximately 4 minutes. And then she drafted a brief internal email to the broadcast coordinator, flagged as a suggested addition to the public letter segment, with Sophie's letter attached as a scanned document. She noted in the email that the letter was original and unvetted, meaning it had not gone through the production team's standard screening process, and that she was recommending it precisely because it was unvetted. Because some things lost something essential when they were screened for palatability. She noted that the letter was from a child. She noted the cardinal. She sent the email and went back to the rest of her stack. On the other side of the building, Cole Whitmore was on a call with 3 board members about a contractual dispute in Singapore and had been on that call for 2.5 hours and would be on it for another 40 minutes before it resolved into a temporary understanding that satisfied no one completely and prevented an immediate legal escalation, which was the best available outcome. He did not know that a letter written in careful cursive on a sheet of lined notebook paper by an 8-year-old girl in Harlan County, Kentucky, had arrived in his building that morning. He did not know that it had a cardinal in the corner. He did not know about the frog jar or the creek or the biscuits or the $17. He would know all of it in 4 days. For Thursday morning arrived in New York with the particular gray efficiency of a late October day that had already decided it was not going to be remarkable. The kind of day that exists in cities as infrastructure rather than atmosphere, functional, cool, the buildings neither warm nor cold in the pale light. The people on the sidewalks moving with the compressed purposefulness of people who have somewhere to be and have calibrated their pace precisely. Cole Whitmore arrived at the American Morning Studios at 6:45 in a black car with his communications director and his coat collar turned up against the wind. He had slept approximately 5 hours on a red-eye from London that had been delayed by 40 minutes at Heathrow, and he had read his briefing materials on the plane in the tight, efficient way he read things when time was limited, which was how he read most things. He knew the talking points. He knew the format. He knew the name of the host and had watched 3 episodes of the program to calibrate what kind of conversation it would be. What he did not know was that Patricia had added a letter to the segment. He learned this in the green room 7 minutes before air when his communications director handed him a copy of the revised segment outline and said, with the studied neutrality of someone delivering information they expect to require navigation, "There's an addition to the public letters portion. Patricia submitted it directly to the production team Monday." "I've read it." A pause. "You should read it before you go on." Cole looked at him. His director handed him the sheet. Cole read it standing up. During the way he read things, when he was already moving toward something else, quickly and with the part of his attention that was not tracking the room. He read the first paragraph and slowed down. He read the second paragraph. He stopped. He stood in the green room with its fluorescent light and its tray of pastries no one was eating, and its wall of monitors showing the live feed of the program already in progress. And he read Sophie Briggs's letter from beginning to end for the first time. His communications director was watching him. Cole set the paper down on the counter next to the pastries. He picked up his coffee cup and took a measured sip. He looked at the monitor for a moment without seeing what was on it. "How old is she?" he said. "8, his director said. "She's a 3rd grader in Harlan County." Cole was quiet. "Actually, we have the other letters from the production stack," his director said carefully. "If you'd rather." "No," Cole said. He picked up Sophie's letter again. He looked at the cardinal. He had grown up in a 3-bedroom house in Durham, North Carolina, the second of 4 children, in a family that had not been wealthy and had not been poor, but had lived in the specific geography between them, where you understood viscerally what money meant and what its absence felt like, but were not in immediate danger of losing the house. His father had been a high school history teacher. His mother had worked the front desk at an insurance company. They had taken one vacation in his entire childhood, a 4-day drive to the Outer Banks, and he remembered it in more specific detail than almost anything else from those years. And he did not think about those years often. He thought about them now, standing in a green room in Manhattan holding a letter written by a child who had $17 in a frog jar and a grandmother who could no longer walk to the creek. "I'm going to read it on air," he said, not as a question. His director said after a moment, "That's not scripted." "I know," Cole said. They looked at each other. "Okay," his director said. The floor manager knocked twice on the green room door. 2 minutes. Cole straightened his jacket. He picked up Sophie's letter and folded it carefully along its existing creases, the way it had been folded when it came out of the envelope, the way an 8-year-old girl had folded it, sitting at a kitchen table in Harlan County, while the house was quiet and the light was off beneath her grandmother's door. He put it in his inside jacket pocket. He walked toward the studio. 4.2 million people were watching. None of them knew yet that a letter written in careful cursive with a cardinal in the corner was about to walk into the room. The American Morning Studio was the kind of room that was designed to feel warmer than it was. Honey-tone wood paneling, soft amber uplighting along the baseboards, A sitting area arranged around a low table with a glass vase of fresh flowers that were replaced each morning by a production assistant whose sole responsibility, as far as Cole could determine, was ensuring that no guest ever sat beside wilting flowers on national television. The cameras were large and quiet and numerous, positioned with the precision of something that had been perfected over years of daily broadcasts. And the crew moved between them with the automatic grace of people who have done the same thing so many times that competence has become indistinguishable from ease. Greta Parks was already at the sitting area when Cole was walked to his mark by the floor manager. She stood to meet him, which he noted and appreciated because it was a small courtesy that not everyone extended. And small courtesies were the ones Cole had come, over a long career, to pay the most attention to. She was in her late 40s, composed and genuinely warm in the way that some television personalities were warm and others merely performed warmth, and the difference was legible if you knew what to look for. She shook his hand and said his name correctly, without the slight emphasis on the first syllable that some people defaulted to, and then they sat, and then the floor manager counted them in, and the broadcast resumed from commercial. The first segment went as scripted. Greta asked about the data breach. Cole gave the response he had prepared, measured and specific and honest in the way that responses, carefully prepared to sound honest, can be honest. He took responsibility for the failures that were his responsibility and drew a clear line around the ones that were systemic rather than personal, because he had learned that the public will accept the former and resent the latter only if you conflate them. He talked about the changes the company had implemented. He used the word accountability 3 times because his communications director had told him not to use it more than twice. And on the third instance, he saw his director, standing just off camera, close his eyes briefly. And he meant it, though. That was the thing that would not translate cleanly through a television screen, the thing that looked identical to performance from the outside. He meant what he said about accountability. He had spent 2 decades building something, and he understood, more completely than most, the difference between a failure that could be absorbed and one that revealed something structural about the thing you had built. This had been the second kind. He had been awake at 3 in the morning, more nights than he could count since August, not with the particular anxious wakefulness of a man worried about public perception, but with the harder, quieter wakefulness of a person who has discovered something about himself that he is still in the process of integrating. The segment ended. Greta shifted in her chair, one the slight physical recalibration that signals a change in emotional register, and said, "I want to move to something a little different. We asked our viewers and the public to send in letters, questions, thoughts, things they wanted to say to you directly. We've received quite a few." She looked at him with the expression of a host who knows what is coming and is watching for his reaction. "I'd like to read a few, if that's all right with you." "I'd actually like to read one myself," Cole said. Greta's expression moved, not dramatically, but perceptibly, into something that was not on the segment outline. "One came to my office earlier this week," Cole continued. "I read it this morning." He reached into his inside jacket pocket. "I'd like to read it on air, if that's all right." "Of course," Greta said. He unfolded the letter. The paper was slightly soft at the creases from being folded and unfolded. He smoothed it against his knee. He looked at it for a moment without reading, the way you look at something you are preparing yourself for. Then he began. He read it the way it had been written, slowly and plainly without performance, following the careful cursive of an 8-year-old girl who had been told to write something true and had written something completely true. He read about Harlan County and the strip of light beneath the grandmother's door. He read about the 2 jobs in the manila envelope under the dish towels. He read about the $17 in the frog jar. He read about the creek and the rocks and the birds, and the fact that Nora Briggs knew the names of all the sparrows, even the ones most people considered too common to bother with. And he read the offer of biscuit lessons and the offer of a drawing, and the apology at the end for not knowing the right way to ask for something. He read it to the end. He folded it back along its creases. The studio was completely silent. Not the silence of a room that has been emptied of sound, but the silence of a room that has been filled with something too large for ordinary noise to coexist with. Greta Parks, who had been in broadcast journalism for 22 years and had interviewed 4 presidents and had conducted the exit interview with the CEO of a pharmaceutical company whose testimony had later contributed to a federal indictment, sat across from Cole Whitmore with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes doing the thing that eyes do when a person is deciding with everything they have not to let them fill. One of the camera operators, a man in his 50s who had been working the same floor camera since the studio's renovation in 2011, looked away from his viewfinder for just a moment. It was the first time in 14 years of working that studio that anyone had seen him do that during a live broadcast. Cole set the letter on the table. "I don't know Sophie Briggs," he said. His voice was even, the way it was even when he was working hardest to keep it that way. "I don't know her grandmother. I don't know her mother. I know what's in this letter." A pause. "I'd like to know the rest." Greta looked at him for a long moment. Then she said softly, "In a register that was not the broadcast register. That was the register of a person speaking to another person." "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to find them," he said. "Cool, and I'm going to do something about this." The segment ran 47 seconds over time. No one cut to commercial. The clip was 18 minutes and 43 seconds long in its original broadcast form. By 11 o'clock that morning, a 40-second version had been cut and posted to the American Morning social accounts. By 1 o'clock, it had been viewed 2.3 million times. By 3 o'clock, it had passed 7 million. By midnight, it had been seen by more people than watched the original broadcast. Most of those people had never heard of Harlan County, Kentucky. Most of them had never thought specifically about what a manila envelope full of medical bills felt like in the hand of a woman who opened it alone at a kitchen table after her child was asleep. Most of them had never considered, in any particular detail, how much of the act of leaving a light strip beneath a door and what it meant to a child watching for it. They thought about all of these things now. The comments numbered in the hundreds of thousands by the following morning. Most of them were some version of the same sentence. "I need to find out what happens next." And beneath them, in the particular way that the internet assembles itself around a thing it has decided matters, people had already begun searching. Harlan County, Kentucky, Sophie Briggs, Nora Briggs, the Whitmore Systems Foundation address, how to help. A woman in Portland who had never donated to anything in her life sent $200 to a GoFundMe that a stranger had set up with Sophie's name in the title before the day was out, before anyone knew if the family had consented to such a thing or knew it existed. A retired school teacher in Alabama recorded herself reading Sophie's letter aloud and posted it, and it was shared 50,000 times in 6 hours, and she wept at the end and did not apologize for it, and nobody who watched thought she should. A cardiologist in Nashville posted a thread explaining exactly what congestive heart failure meant and what it cost and why it was the kind of thing that eroded families financially in specific, grinding, relentless ways, and it was retweeted 140,000 times before noon. None of this reached Diane Briggs. Diane had worked the 5 to midnight shift the night before and had been asleep since 1 in the morning when the broadcast aired at 8. She woke up at 10, made coffee in the quiet kitchen, checked on her mother, Otrena, who was having a reasonable morning and had eaten the half portion of scrambled eggs that was currently the amount her appetite allowed, and then sat at the kitchen table with her phone and scrolled through the usual accumulation of notifications from the grocery chain's employee app. 2 text messages from the motel about a schedule adjustment, 1 voicemail from the pharmacy about a prescription that needed to be picked up. She did not have a social media account. She had deleted it 2 years ago when the combination of other people's curated contentment and her own unmediated life had made it feel like a form of self-harm she could choose to stop inflicting. Sophie was at school. Nora was in her room reading a novel from the library's large print shelf, which she had gotten through her reading glasses with the stronger lenses that the ophthalmologist had prescribed in June. The world outside their house was full of people saying Sophie's name. The world inside their house was simply Tuesday. Cole Whitmore did not return to the green room after the broadcast. He stood in the hallway just off the studio floor with his coat over his arm and his communications director beside him and said without preamble, "I need Patricia on the phone." His director handed him his phone. Patricia answered on the second ring in the way she always answered, as though she had been expecting the call and was simply waiting for the correct moment. "The family," Cole said. "I need everything we can find that's a matter of public record. Nothing intrusive. I want the name of her doctor, and I want to understand exactly what the medical situation is. I want to know if there's a GoFundMe or anything set up in their names, and if there is, I want it handled appropriately." "Already started," Patricia said. "I'll have an initial summary within 2 hours." He was quiet for a moment. "The letter came directly to you." "Yes." "You added it to the segment." "Yes." "You didn't tell me first." A brief pause, the kind that in Patricia's register meant she had already considered this and had her reasoning in order. "If I had told you first, you would have reviewed it in advance. You would have prepared something. You are very good at preparing things." Another pause. The letter didn't need preparation. It needed to be read by someone who hadn't prepared. Cole looked at the floor. "She drew a cardinal," he said. "Oh, I noticed," Patricia said. "Her grandmother's favorite bird." "I know," he exhaled slowly. "All right, 2 hours. And Patricia—" He stopped. He tried to say the thing he was trying to say, which was not about logistics. "Thank you for seeing it." Patricia was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line. Then, with the warmth she deployed rarely and precisely, "Go get some rest. You have work to do." The summary arrived in 1 hour and 50 minutes. Cole read it in his car on the way back to the hotel, not at the speed he usually read things, but slowly, the way he had read the letter that morning. Patricia had assembled what she could from public records. The county property records showing the house on Callaway Creek Road. The school enrollment records that confirmed Sophie was a third grader at Valley View Elementary. A news item from the Harlan County Enterprise from 18 months ago that mentioned Nora Briggs by name in a brief community notice about a church bake sale she had organized. Her last public activity before the illness had contracted her world. The medical situation, as best as Patricia had been able to reconstruct from publicly accessible insurance dispute records and the limited information available, was consistent with what Sophie had described. Advanced heart failure, managed with medication and periodic monitoring, the kind of condition that required consistent, expensive maintenance, and whose trajectory was measured in stability rather than improvement. The medical debt figure was not in the summary. Patricia had noted that she had not been able to confirm a number from public sources and had declined to estimate. At the bottom of the summary, a single additional note in Patricia's clean font. Sophie's teacher, Mrs. Callaway, is the person who readdressed the envelope and ensured it reached the correct office. She is 19 years into a teaching career in Harlan County. She has never lived anywhere else. She mentioned when I reached her this afternoon that Sophie asked to put the letter in the school mailbox during recess rather than waiting until the end of the day. She wanted to say she thought about it at school and then she just did it. She didn't wait. Cole sat with his phone in his hand and the city moving past the car window and thought about an 8-year-old girl who had not waited. He had built a company that employed 200,000 people. He had given, over the past decade, through the Whitmore Foundation, more than $300 million to causes ranging from clean water infrastructure in sub-Saharan Africa to rural broadband access in underserved American counties. He had funded research programs and scholarship endowments and community development initiatives and had done it, he had always told himself and others, because he understood the structural nature of inequality and the leverage that capital could apply to structural problems. He had done all of this, and he had not, in perhaps 15 years, sat in a car with a piece of paper in his hand and felt something as uncomplicated as the thing he was feeling now. It was not pity. He had understood from the moment he read Sophie's letter that pity was exactly what the letter did not ask for and would not receive from anyone paying honest attention. It asked for recognition. It asked for someone to look at a family doing everything correctly in a system that was failing them and say, I see it. I see you. This is not what it should be. He called Patricia back. I'd like to go there, he said. A pause. To Harlan County. Yes. When? This week. Thursday. I want to go without announcement. No press, no communications team. I want to meet them. Another pause, longer this time. Cole? She only used his first name when she was about to say something that required the weight of it. This family does not know their daughter wrote to you. They do not know the broadcast happened. They are not expecting anything. If you arrive at that house without preparation, you risk overwhelming them, specifically the mother. A beat. She sounds like a person who does not like to feel that her circumstances are a spectacle. He was quiet for a moment. She was right. She was usually right, which was why he had kept her close for 11 years. Then how, he said. Carefully, Patricia said. I have a thought. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. It was Patricia who reached Mrs. Calloway first. She called on a Wednesday evening at 6:30 after the school day had ended and the teacher would be at home, rather than in a classroom where a ringing phone was an interruption. Mrs. Calloway answered on the third ring. Her voice was the voice of a woman who had taught children for 19 years, which meant it contained equal measures of warmth and no-nonsense, and she had applied both of these qualities to the phone call from the executive administrator of one of the largest technology companies in the world, with the same equanimity she applied to everything else. Patricia explained the situation clearly and without embellishment. The broadcast had aired. The letter had been read. Cole Whitmore wanted to meet the family. He did not want it to be a spectacle. He needed someone the family trusted to prepare them first. Mrs. Calloway was quiet for a moment after Patricia finished. Does the family know about the broadcast? She asked. Not yet, Patricia said. That is part of what we'd like your guidance on. Another pause. Sophie's mother, Diane. She is a private person. She has worked very hard to keep her family's situation from being something she needs other people's feelings about. A measured breath. If you tell her the wrong way, she will shut the door. I understand, Patricia said. That's why I'm calling you instead of calling her. Mrs. Calloway was quiet again for longer this time. I'll go see her tomorrow morning, she said finally. Before school. She'll be home between shifts. A pause. And I want you to know something. Sophie wrote that letter because she wanted to help her grandmother, not because she wanted to be on television or have people feel sorry for them. If this turns into something that makes Sophie regret writing it, that is not all right with me. It will not, Patricia said. I'm going to hold you to that, Mrs. Calloway said. I'd expect nothing less, Patricia said. Mrs. Calloway arrived at the house on Calloway Creek Road at 7:45 on Thursday morning, which was after Diane had returned from the Motor Lodge's early opening and before her second job required her to leave. She had called ahead the night before with no explanation beyond I'd like to stop by if that's all right, which Diane had agreed to in the careful way she agreed to things from teachers, attentive to any implication that Sophie might need something she had not been able to provide. Sophie was at school. Nora was still asleep. Diane met Mrs. Calloway at the door in her work clothes, her hair tied back, her face carrying the particular alertness of someone who has trained themselves to be present, even when present requires significant effort. They sat at the kitchen table. There was coffee. Mrs. Calloway told her everything. She told her about the assignment. She told her about Sophie bringing the letter to her desk during recess, about the careful cursive and the cardinal in the corner. She told her about readdressing the envelope and sending it to the Whitmore Systems executive offices. She told her about the broadcast. She watched Diane's face move through a sequence of expressions that were not large or dramatic, but were entirely legible. The slight tightening around the eyes when she heard about the assignment, the stillness in the jaw when she heard about the letter's contents as Mrs. Calloway summarized them, the specific quality of controlled breathing that Diane deployed when something arrived that was larger than she had the immediate capacity to hold. When Mrs. Calloway finished, Diane was looking at the table. "Eager of 4 million people," Diane said. "More now," Mrs. Calloway said carefully. Diane was quiet. "She didn't tell me," Diane said, not accusatory, not directed at Mrs. Calloway, just the plainest possible statement of a thing that was true. "She didn't want you to feel like you needed help," Mrs. Calloway said. Diane closed her eyes. She pressed her fingers against her mouth for a moment. Then she lowered her hand. She looked at Mrs. Calloway with the expression of a woman whose love for her daughter is so complete and so structural that even in a moment of surprise it does not shake, it simply becomes visible. "She's 8 years old," Diane said. "Yes," Mrs. Calloway said, "and she wrote a letter to the richest man in the world because she couldn't fix it herself, and she couldn't sit still and do nothing." "Yes," Mrs. Calloway said. Ah, Diane laughed once. The short, wet kind of laugh that comes when something is too sad and too perfect simultaneously to be processed by any other sound. She pressed the back of her hand against her eyes. "He wants to meet you," Mrs. Calloway said. "Cole Whitmore. He wants to come here. No press, no cameras. He asked me to prepare you first because his administrator said the wrong approach would shut the door." Diane looked up. "She was right," Diane said. "I know." They were quiet for a moment. Through the wall, the sound of Nora shifting in her bed, the familiar small sounds of a woman moving carefully. "I need to think," Diane said. "Of course. I need to talk to my mother." A pause. "And to Sophie." "Of course." Diane looked at the table for a moment longer. Then she looked at Mrs. Calloway. "What do you think?" Mrs. Calloway had been a third-grade teacher in Harlan County for 19 years. She had given a great many forms of honest counsel in that time, and she had learned that the most useful thing you could offer a person facing something unfamiliar was not reassurance, which was comfortable but often inaccurate, but clarity, which was sometimes harder and always more respectful. "I think Sophie did something brave and true," she said. "I think it reached someone. I think what happens next is yours to decide, not mine." She met Diane's eyes. "But I think not deciding is also a decision, and I don't think that's the kind of person you are." Diane looked at her. "No," she said. "It's not." Sophie came home from school that afternoon to find her mother sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that had gone cold and an expression on her face that was not upset and was not frightened, but was the particular expression Sophie associated with the moments when her mother was holding something very carefully. Sophie set her backpack down. "Mrs. Calloway came by," Diane said. Sophie's stomach did the thing it did when she had done something she was not entirely sure she was supposed to have done. She sat down across from her mother. "I mailed the letter," she said. It was not an apology. It was simply an acknowledgement. "I know," Diane said. "She told me." Silence. "Are you in trouble?" Sophie asked. Diane looked at her daughter. She looked at her for a long moment, and at the small, serious face and the backpack straps and the blue sneakers with the Velcro tabs and the expression of a child who was preparing herself to be told something difficult and had decided to meet it straight on. "No," Diane said. "Are you?" Sophie thought about it. "I don't think so." Me neither. Diane reached across the table and took both of Sophie's hands in hers. I need to tell you something. A breath. The letter got there. The man read it. He read it on television, baby, on a big show in New York City, in front of a lot of people. Sophie was very still. He wants to come meet us, Diane said. Cole Whitmore. He wants to come here. Sophie stared at the table. Then she looked up at her mother. Is Grandma going to be okay? She asked. That was the only question. It had always been the only question. Diane squeezed her hands. She held them tightly. I don't know yet, she said, because she was a person who told her daughter the truth. But I think we're going to find out. Nora took the news in the way she took most things, which was quietly and with the slight smile of a person who is not surprised by what people are capable of when they are paying attention. I always knew she'd do something that stopped the room, Nora said. She was sitting up in her bed with her reading glasses on top of her head and the library novel on her lap. She's been that way since she was 3 years old. You'd be in the middle of something ordinary, and she would say the one true thing, and everything would just go still. She's 8, Diane said from the doorway. I know how old she is, Nora said. I was there. She looked at her daughter with the clear, steady eyes that had not changed, regardless of what the illness had taken from the rest of her. Are you going to let him come? Diane leaned against the doorframe. I don't know. What's stopping you? A pause. Diane looked at the wall. I don't want it to be something it's not. I don't want Sophie to think the world works a certain way because of one extraordinary thing. I don't want her to feel like she was in a story. Nora was quiet for a moment. She's already in a story. We all are. She adjusted the reading glasses on top of her head. The question is whether it's one where people respond to each other or one where they don't. She looked at Diane with the directness that had always been the most characteristically Nora thing about her. She reached out, Diane. Someone reached back. That is not a lesson I'm willing to tell her she was wrong to hope for. Diane looked at her mother. All right, she said. All right, Nora said. She picked up her novel. Now can you bring me a glass of water? The real kind, not the filtered kind. The filtered one tastes like a fish tank. Diane laughed. It was the real kind of laugh, the unrehearsed kind, the kind that arrived from somewhere genuinely lighter. Mom, I'm sick, Nora said serenely. I get to have opinions about my water. The call came Friday evening. Diane answered and heard Patricia Osie's voice, which was warm and organized in equal measure, and which did the thing that Diane had identified in her first 30 seconds on the phone as the particular quality of a person who was used to navigating difficult situations between powerful people and everyone else without making the everyone else feel like a problem to be managed. Patricia asked if Sunday would be acceptable. Diane said yes. He won't be bringing anyone, Patricia said. No press, no cameras, no communication staff. He'll drive himself. A slight pause. He wanted me to tell you specifically. He is not coming to make a statement. He is coming because Sophie wrote a letter and he read it. And what he does next, he wants to do in person. Diane held the phone against her ear and looked out the kitchen window at the backyard, where the garden had gone to its late autumn quiet. On the sunflower stalks dry and brown against the fence, the marigolds long past, the tomato cages standing empty. Sunday is fine, she said. After she hung up, she sat at the table for a while. She thought about the envelope under the dish towels. She thought about the phone call with the hospital billing department that Sophie had heard through the wall. She thought about the credit card minimum payment and the prescription copay and the fuel cost for the 2 jobs and the winter heating bill that was coming. She thought about her daughter, who at 8 years old had sat at this same table and addressed a letter to the richest man in the world, North Carolina, I think, and had sent it anyway. Diane had not cried since the day of her mother's diagnosis, not because the feeling had not been there, but because crying had seemed, way in the 18 months since, like a luxury she could not afford the recovery time from. She had things to do. She had always had things to do. She cried now, briefly at the kitchen table, with no one watching and no particular occasion for it, except the accumulated weight of 18 months of doing the thing that needed doing, and the sudden, unfamiliar sensation that something was coming toward them rather than away. She let herself have it for 3 minutes. Then she washed her face at the kitchen sink and went to check on her mother. Sunday arrived with the particular stillness of a late October morning that has decided to be beautiful without making a fuss about it. The sky above Harlan County was the clear pale blue that follows cold nights. And the light came in at an angle that made the dry fields and the dark tree lines look like something painted rather than simply lived in. Diane had been up since 5. She had cleaned the house in the specific way she cleaned when she was managing anxiety through action, thoroughly and with attention to corners. She had put fresh flowers on the kitchen table from the grocery store, which she had justified to herself as simply replacing the ones that had wilted, which was true and which had the secondary effect of making the kitchen look like a room that had been prepared for something. Nora had dressed herself in her good blue house dress and refused Diane's help with her hair, which she pinned up herself with 2 pearl-top pins she kept in a ceramic dish on the dresser. She looked, sitting in the chair by the kitchen window with her hands folded and the morning light on her face, like the woman she had always been, just quieter, more distilled. Sophie had put on the dress her grandmother had bought her for Easter, purple with small white flowers, which she had declared the previous evening was the appropriate thing to wear when an important person was visiting, and which Diane had not argued with. At 9:47, a car turned onto Callaway Creek Road. It was not the car any of them had imagined. They had imagined something large and black and decisive. What turned onto the road was a dark blue 4-door that was clean but not new, practical and unremarkable. The kind of car that could have belonged to a doctor or a professor or a man who had simply decided he did not need the car to announce anything. Cole Whitmore parked in front of the house and got out. He was taller than he appeared on television. He was wearing a dark jacket over a plain shirt, and he had left his glasses in the car, which he did sometimes in situations where he did not want to seem like he was evaluating. He stood beside the car for a moment and looked at the house, the front porch with the wooden railing, the garden to the side where the sunflower stalks stood dry against the fence, the window with the electrical tape sealing the crack, which had been there so long it had become part of the house's face. He had been in boardrooms with heads of state. He had sat across tables from people who controlled the governance of countries. But he had navigated negotiations that moved markets and shaped policy in ways that would not be fully understood for a decade after they occurred. He had never stood in front of a house and felt as specifically aware of the weight of what he was about to do as he did at this moment. He walked to the front door. Diane opened it before he knocked. They looked at each other, the woman who had worked 2 jobs for 18 months and done the arithmetic on the back of envelopes and hummed hymns in the kitchen when the worry became too large to carry silently, and the man who had read her daughter's letter on live television and had not been able to put it down since. "Mr. Whitmore," Diane said. "Ms. Briggs," Cole said. "Thank you for letting me come." A brief pause. The particular pause of 2 people who have heard a great deal about each other through an intermediary and are now meeting the actual person for the first time, taking in the distance between the idea and the real. "Come in," Diane said. He came through the door into the kitchen, and Sophie, sitting at the kitchen table in her purple Easter dress, with her hands folded on the table in front of her, looked up at him with an expression that was completely direct and entirely without pretense. The expression of a child who has decided to look at a thing honestly and is doing exactly that. Cole looked back at her. He thought about the letter. He thought about the cardinal. He thought about an 8-year-old girl who had sat at this table and addressed an envelope to the richest man in the world because she could not sit still and do nothing, and who had drawn a bird in the corner because she wanted the letter to have something of her grandmother in it. "You're Sophie," he said. "Yes," she said. "Did you get my letter?" "I did," he said. She studied him. "Did you like the cardinal?" "I tried to make it look real. My grandma knows all the birds." "I could tell," he said. "It looked real." Sophie nodded once, apparently satisfied with this answer. Then she turned toward the hallway. "Grandma," she called, "he's here." The sound of soft slippers on the hallway floor, the careful, measured progress of a woman who moves slowly and with intention. And then Nora Briggs came through the kitchen doorway in her blue house dress, with her white hair pinned up and her brown eyes clear and direct. And she looked at Cole Whitmore in the kitchen of her house on Callaway Creek Road in Harlan County, Kentucky, with the particular expression of a woman who has lived 67 years and has come to understand the difference between the things that are ordinary and the things that are not. "Well," she said, "you'd better sit down." Cole sat. Diane poured coffee. And in the particular quiet of that kitchen on a Sunday morning in October, with the light coming in from the east and the dry sunflower stalks visible through the window, something began that none of them yet had the full language for, but that all of them, in their separate ways, already understood was real. They sat at that kitchen table for 2 hours and 40 minutes. Cole would not be able to account for the time afterward in the way he could usually account for time, which was in segments defined by decisions made and problems advanced. This was something different. This was simply 2 hours and 40 minutes of people being honest with each other in a kitchen that smelled like coffee and the faint sweetness of the biscuits Nora had insisted on making that morning, over Diane's careful objections, with the reply that she had been making biscuits for 40 years and her heart condition did not change the recipe. The biscuits were on the table in a cloth-covered basket, and they were extraordinary in the specific way that food made from long practice and genuine care is extraordinary. Not elaborate, not showy, simply correct in every proportion in the way that only comes from a person who has made the same thing so many times that the knowledge has moved from their mind into their hands. Cole ate 2 of them without being asked. Nora noticed, the way she noticed everything, and said nothing, which was its own form of welcome. The conversation began carefully, the way conversations begin when the people in them are aware of the distance between what they know about each other and what is actually true. Cole asked about Nora's condition in the plane, direct way that Nora appreciated, and Diane had braced herself not to resent, because she had anticipated a version of this question that was performative, and what arrived instead was simply a man who wanted to understand what was actually happening. Nora explained it herself. She was precise and unsentimental, the way people are precise and unsentimental about their own illness, when they have had time to make their peace with its terms. Her ejection fraction was reduced. The medications managed the fluid retention but required regular adjustment. The fatigue was the part she found most aggravating, she said, because it arrived without warning and took from her the hours she would most like to use. "What do you do with the good hour?" Cole asked. Nora looked at him. "Garden when the season allows. Read. Watch the birds." A slight smile. "Complain about the filtered water." Sophie, sitting at the end of the table with a biscuit and a glass of milk, said without looking up, "She knows every bird by name, even the boring ones." "Sparrows are not boring," Nora said. "You always say that." "I always mean it." Cole looked between them, and something in his chest did something that was not businesslike in any way. It was the particular feeling of witnessing something intact, a thing that had held its shape under pressure. A love that had not been simplified by difficulty, but deepened by it. He thought about his own daughters. He thought about the dinners he had missed, the school events he had attended half of, and the ones he had attended in body while his mind ran 3 time zones ahead. He thought about the expression on his younger daughter's face the last time he had seen her, patient and accustomed to his particular form of partial presence in the way that children become accustomed to the specific shape of the parent they actually have rather than the one they might wish for. He looked at Sophie in her purple Easter dress, eating her biscuit with complete concentration. He set his coffee cup down. "I want to tell you what I like to do," he said, and I want you to tell me if any part of it is wrong." Diane looked at him steadily. She had the posture of a person braced to receive something without flinching. It was the posture she had been practicing for 18 months. "I want to settle the medical debt completely," Cole said. "All of it. Whatever remains after insurance, whatever has been deferred, whatever is currently in dispute. I want a clean number and I want it cleared." He paused. "I also want to establish an ongoing care arrangement with a cardiologist in Lexington who specializes in advanced heart failure management, someone who works with the full picture rather than the piece that each appointment covers. Patricia has already identified 3 names. I'd like Nora to choose." Diane said nothing. She was looking at the table. "Manya, the motor lodge job and the warehouse job," Cole continued. "I'd like those to stop." Diane looked up. "Not because work is beneath you," he said carefully, "because you have been running at a pace that is not sustainable for a person who also needs to be present for the people in this house. And because," he paused. He had prepared this part, and he set the preparation aside because Patricia had been right about prepared things. "Because I read your daughter's letter, and one of the things she told me, without meaning to, was that she can hear you doing the dishes at night. She can hear you from her room. She knows the sound you make when you're trying not to show her that you're worried." He met Diane's eyes. "That is too much for a person to carry alone. And it's too much for an 8-year-old to hear through a wall." The kitchen was very quiet. Sophie had put her biscuit down. Diane pressed her lips together and looked at the window and did the controlled breathing, in through the nose, the way she always did. "There's a nursing program," Cole said. "You enrolled before your mother's diagnosis. You were 3 semesters from completion." Diane turned back to look at him. "How do you know that?" "Patricia," he said simply. "Public enrollment records." "I'm sorry if that feels intrusive. I wanted to understand the whole picture." Diane was still for a moment. Then she said quietly, "That's a long time ago." 19 months is not a long time," Cole said. "Not in the scale of a career. The prerequisite credits don't expire for another 2 years. The program at UK has a part-time track. You could finish in 18 months. A pause. "I'd like to cover the tuition and the fees. Whatever the program costs, I want it not to be the reason." Diane looked at him for a long time. Her expression was not what Cole had expected, which was relief or gratitude or some combination of both. It was something more complicated than either. It was the expression of a woman who had spent a year and a half protecting her family by containing the problem inside herself, who was now being asked to set down something she had held so tightly and for so long that she was not entirely certain her hands remembered how to open. "Why?" she said, not ungratefully, genuinely. Cole thought about the question. He answered it honestly. "Because your daughter wrote a letter at 8 years old that said more true things in 2 pages than I have managed to say in 54 years of public life. Because she offered me biscuit lessons and a drawing of a bird because she had nothing else to offer, and she offered it without shame." He paused. "And because I have more than I could spend in 10 lifetimes, and a family in Harlan County is doing the math on a medical bill at a kitchen table, and if I can change that and I choose not to, then I don't know what I've been building any of this for." The kitchen was silent again. Nora, who had been listening from her chair by the window with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes clear and steady, said, "Well," she said it the way she had said it when he walked in, with the settled finality of a woman who has reached a conclusion. She looked at Diane. "Baby," she said, "let the man help." Diane made a sound that was the wet, compressed cousin of a laugh. She pressed her hand over her eyes. "I'm going to need a minute," she said. Take all the time you need, Cole said. Sophie slid off her chair and walked around the table and climbed onto the chair next to her grandmother's and leaned against Nora's arm. Nora put her hand on top of Sophie's head without looking, the automatic gesture of a woman who has been doing exactly this for 8 years and could do it in the dark. Cole looked at them. He thought about the crossword left half-finished. He thought about the back porch. He thought about the lonely, complicated shape that money could take when it replaced the things it could not actually replace. He thought about what it meant to sit at a kitchen table with people who still had what he had spent years working around the edges of, without ever quite naming the absence. The call from his communications director came at 4:30 that afternoon, while Cole was driving back toward Lexington on Route 119. He answered on the second ring. "The board wants a statement," his director said. The flatness in his voice indicated he had already had a version of this conversation with the board and was now relaying the request with the particular neutrality of someone who is delivering a message they personally find objectionable. "What kind of statement?" Cole said. "A commitment announcement. The full amount, press release, photo opportunity. They want to frame it as a Whitmore Foundation initiative. Rural healthcare access. Something like that." A pause. "Margaret Chen specifically is pushing for the photo. She thinks the optics coming out of the data breach—" "No," Cole said. "Cole, the answer is no. This is not a Whitmore Foundation initiative. It is a personal commitment. It is not a press release. It is not a photo opportunity. It is a family in Harlan County who asked for privacy, and I told them I would give it to them." His voice was even and final in the way it was final when he had reached the end of a decision rather than the beginning of a negotiation. "If Margaret Chen wants to discuss rural healthcare access as a foundation priority, I am happy to have that conversation in January. That conversation has nothing to do with this family." Silence on the line. "She'll push back," his director said. "She'll say you're making a significant personal financial commitment without board visibility, and that sets a precedent." "She's welcome to push back," Cole said. "I've been making significant personal financial commitments without board visibility since 1998. The board has a governance role over the company. They do not have a governance role over my personal checkbook." A pause. "Tell Margaret I said that exactly. She'll appreciate the directness." Another silence. Then, with the slight release of someone who has been carrying someone else's argument and is glad to set it down, "All right." "One more thing," Cole said. "The GoFundMe someone set up in Sophie's name. How much is in it?" "Last I checked, just over $42,000. Cole was quiet for a moment. "Contact the organizer. I want to work with them to transfer the funds to the family directly, on their terms, at a time they choose. Not as a spectacle. Quietly." "Understood. And cancel the photo." "There was never a confirmed photo," his director said. "Cancel it anyway," Cole said. He hung up and drove for a while in the particular silence of a decision that has been made cleanly and does not require further examination. The fields ran flat on either side of Route 119, brown and open under the pale October sky. And somewhere behind him, the house on Callaway Creek Road sat in the afternoon light with the garden going to its late-season quiet and the sunflower stalks dry against the fence. And inside it, a woman sat at a kitchen table with her hands open for the first time in 18 months. And an old woman with clear brown eyes ate a biscuit by the window, and a child in a purple Easter dress drew a bird on the back of a piece of paper with a red-colored pencil, pressing firmly so the color was solid. He thought about the fact that none of this would have happened if an 8-year-old had not decided not to wait. He thought about what it meant to build something with 200,000 people depending on it, and still missed the thing that a third grader in Harlan County had understood by instinct. He drove for a while without the radio. The weeks that followed moved in the way that weeks move when something real has shifted, and the evidence accumulates not in single dramatic moments, but in the ordinary texture of changed circumstances. The medical debt was cleared on a Thursday. Patricia handled it directly, sure contacting each billing entity separately, settling each account in full, confirming receipt and closure in writing. The manila envelope beneath the dish towels became obsolete. Diane moved it from the kitchen drawer to the recycling bin on a Sunday evening and stood at the recycling bin for a moment after the lid closed. The way you stand over something you have finally been allowed to put down. Nora's new cardiologist was a woman named Dr. Anita Sharma, who practiced at a clinic in Lexington and who had, according to her patient reviews and her colleagues in equal measure, the specific gift of treating the person rather than the condition. Her approach to Nora's management involved adjustments to two medications that her previous cardiologist had not explored, and a rehabilitation plan so gradual it was almost invisible in its daily increments. It was not a cure. No one had offered a cure, and Diane had been careful not to allow herself to want one, because wanting the impossible was a luxury that required more emotional capital than she currently had. What Dr. Sharma offered was management, real, attentive, continuous management. Within 6 weeks, Nora's fatigue had decreased measurably, not dramatically, not in the way of miracles, in the way of a body that is being attended to correctly responding to correct attention. She began sitting on the porch in the mornings when the weather allowed. She returned to the large print novels from the library. She began, and in the last week of November, to talk about the spring garden, which was not a small thing. It was a very specific kind of hope. Sophie noticed the light beneath the door more often. Diane enrolled in the part-time nursing track at the University of Kentucky in January. She drove to Lexington twice a week for the evening classes, which ran from 6 to 9:30, and she sat in the third row of the lecture hall, not because she had been told to, but because the third row was close enough to see the board clearly and far enough from the front that she could look around the room without drawing attention. She was the oldest student in 2 of her 3 classes, and she was untroubled by this in the specific way of a person who has been given a second chance at something they valued and does not intend to waste any part of it on self-consciousness. She was an excellent student. This surprised no one who knew her, but she was surprised by it, mildly, in the way that you are surprised to discover that the capability you put on the shelf was still exactly where you left it, intact and waiting. Her professor in the fundamentals course, a compact, direct woman in her 60s named Dr. Ellis, told her at the end of the first semester that she had the particular quality that made a good nurse as distinct from a competent one, which was the ability to be fully present with a patient in distress without allowing her own response to the distress to become the thing the patient was now managing. You stayed yourself, Dr. Ellis told her. That is not as common as you might think. Diane thought about humming hymns in the kitchen at midnight. She thought about calibrating her voice carefully on the phone with the billing department so Sophie, listening through the wall, would not hear the fear in it. She thought about what it cost and what it produced, and decided that she understood exactly what Dr. Ellis meant. On a Saturday in late February, something happened that none of them had planned and none of them would forget. Cole Whitmore called. Not Patricia, Cole. He had been calling every 2 or 3 weeks since October. Not long calls, not formal ones. He ran the kind of calls that had begun as check-ins and had become something less defined than check-ins, but more genuine. He asked about Nora's appointments. He asked about Diane's coursework. He asked about Sophie's class, whether they had done any more letter assignments, which Sophie had reported to him in detail when Diane handed her the phone one evening, including the fact that Mrs. Calloway had given her an A and put the letter up on the classroom bulletin board, which Sophie said she found both flattering and slightly embarrassing. This call was different. I want to ask you something, he said when Diane answered. There was a quality in his voice she had not heard before, a slight tentativeness that she associated with people who are about to say something they have been preparing to say for longer than the conversation warrants. Yekker, go ahead, she said. I want to see how Nora's garden looks in the spring, he said. If that's all right, I'd like to come back. Diane was quiet for a moment. In the 2 months since October, she had thought about Cole Whitmore with a frequency she found both informative and inconvenient. Not romantically or not only, but in the way you think about a person when they have entered your life through an unusual door and the usual categories do not quite apply. He was not a benefactor. He was not a friend exactly, not yet. He was a man who had read her daughter's letter and driven a practical blue car to Harlan County and sat at her kitchen table and eaten 2 biscuits and told her the truth about what he intended to do and then done it. That was a category she did not have a precise word for. The garden looks best in June, she said, or when the sunflowers are up. A pause. She could hear the quality of the silence on his end, the kind that is not empty but full of something held carefully. June, he said. June, she said. But before June, there was March. And March brought the thing that Diane had learned in 18 months of practice, to anticipate without bracing against it too hard, the setback. Nora was hospitalized on a Tuesday. It was not unexpected in the way of emergencies. It was expected in the way that anyone managing a serious cardiac condition expects eventually an adjustment period, a recalibration, a period of monitoring. Dr. Sharma had explained the possibility clearly and without alarm, and had given Diane the specific thresholds to watch for. Diane had watched for them. When they arrived, she had called the clinic and done exactly what she was supposed to do, and Nora was admitted to the hospital in Lexington on a Tuesday afternoon and was being monitored and managed by Thursday morning with the particular competent calm of a team that had a clear picture of her condition. The hospital room was quiet and clean, and Nora had her large print novel in her request for non-filtered water, which was granted, and her pearl-topped hairpins, which she had brought in a small bag that Diane had packed for her. Sophie sat in the chair beside the bed every afternoon after school, doing her homework on the tray table while Nora read, and neither of them talked about it being scary because neither of them needed to, because sitting together in the same room was itself the answer to the thing that was scary. On the third evening, when after Sophie had fallen asleep in the chair and Diane had covered her with a hospital blanket, Nora looked at her daughter from the bed and said, in the quiet voice she used when she wanted to say something that mattered, "I'm going to be all right." "I know," Diane said. "I mean it specifically," Nora said. "Not as comfort, as fact." She looked at her daughter with the clear brown eyes. "Dr. Sharma knows what she's doing, and I intend to see those sunflowers in June." Diane took her mother's hand. "You will," she said. "I know," Nora said. "That's what I'm telling you." Nora was discharged on Saturday morning. Dr. Sharma adjusted 2 medications and scheduled a follow-up for 3 weeks out. She sat with Diane for 20 minutes after the discharge paperwork, explaining each change, each threshold to watch for, each sign of improvement. Why she spoke to Diane as a peer rather than a family member, which Diane recognized and absorbed with the particular attention of a first-year nursing student who had just watched a master clinician demonstrate what genuine patient advocacy looked like. She drove home on Route 119 with her mother in the passenger seat and Sophie in the back, with her backpack and her seatbelt, and her face turned toward the window, watching Harlan County appear around them the way it always did, the fields opening out, the tree lines dark against the late winter sky, the familiar specific landscape of a place you have left and come back to enough times that its geography has become interior as well as external. "Almost home," Sophie said. "Almost home," Nora agreed. Diane drove. June came, as promised. The garden on Callaway Creek Road was in its full summer authority by the second week. The tomatoes were running up the south fence. The marigolds stood at each corner with their particular bright insistence. And along the back wall, in a row that Nora had planted herself in April during a morning when the weather was good and her energy was sufficient and she had refused to let Diane help except to carry the seed packets. The sunflowers stood at their full height in the afternoon light, facing east with the composed, unhurried certainty of things that grow because they are simply meant to. Cole arrived on a Saturday morning in the same practical blue car. He had brought nothing elaborate. Coffee from a shop in Lexington and a small book of bird illustrations, which he set on the kitchen table for Nora with a slight formality that was not quite awkward, but was the formality of a man who is not certain how to give a gift and has tried his best. Nora opened it and looked at the plate of the cardinal, and then looked at him. "You've been thinking about this gift for a while," she said. "About a month," he admitted. She said, which in Nora's register meant she approved and did not intend to make it easy for him by saying so directly. They had breakfast, and then they went outside. The garden in June was the full version of what it contained all year in potential. Nora moved through it slowly, one hand occasionally touching the garden stake near the tomatoes for balance, and she named things as she went with the ease of a woman moving through her own house in the dark. Entirely fluent in the language of the place, she told Cole which tomato variety had the best flavor and why the marigolds worked and why the deer respected them, and the specific thing you had to do to sunflower seedlings in the first week that most people did wrong. Cole listened. He listened the way he had listened to Sophie's letter in the green room, completely without preparing what he would say next. Just listening. Sophie walked beside him on the garden path with her red-colored pencil behind her ear because she had been drawing birds from the book all morning and had not thought to put it elsewhere, and she pointed out each sunflower by name because she had named them individually in April and maintained the convention without irony. "That one is Herbert," she told Cole, "because he's the tallest and a little bit serious." "Solid name for a sunflower," Cole said. "I think so," Sophie agreed. At the back of the garden, Nora stopped and looked at the row of sunflowers for a long moment. The afternoon light was behind them, coming through the stalks in irregular panels, the way light comes through something that is alive and full of itself. She had the expression she wore when she was finding the exact right thing in an ordinary moment, the expression Sophie had drawn in her mind since early childhood and would carry for the rest of her life. "I told Diane I'd see them," Nora said. "You did," Cole said beside her. "I generally mean what I say." "I believe that completely," Cole said. Nora looked at him sidelong with the clear brown eyes. "You're going to keep coming back," she said, not a question. Cole was quiet for a moment, then, "If you'll have me." Nora looked at the sunflowers. She had the slight smile, the one with the creases, the full version. "Well," she said, "I suppose the garden can always use another person who knows how to pay attention." Sophie finished third grade with the highest marks in her class. Mrs. Calloway gave her an award at the year-end ceremony for writing, which Sophie received with the composed dignity of a person who is pleased but not surprised, which made Mrs. Calloway laugh in a way that carried all 19 years of her teaching career in it. The letter was still on the classroom bulletin board. Mrs. Calloway had laminated it in October when it became clear that the edges were beginning to soften from being handled by children who wanted to look at the cardinal, and it stayed on the board for the rest of the year, and the class that came after Sophie's looked at it too. The new third graders who did not know Sophie Briggs, but who understood the cardinal immediately, the way children understand certain things before they have the words to explain why. The $42,000 from the GoFundMe was transferred to Diane in May, quietly and on her terms, as Cole had arranged. She put the majority of it into a savings account she had opened for Sophie's education. She put a portion of it toward a new pair of reading glasses for Nora, and the garden supplies for the June planting, and a winter coat for Sophie that fit correctly rather than one size larger to allow for growing, which was how she had been buying Sophie's coats for 2 years. She bought one thing for herself, a single thing, a good pair of shoes, the kind built for long days on hospital floors, for the nursing career that was coming. She ordered them online and they arrived in a box, and she opened them at the kitchen table and held one in her hand for a moment, turning it over. She thought about the shoes she had worn to the motor lodge every morning, the ones that let the cold through at the toe. She thought about the months she had spent meaning to replace them. She thought about an 8-year-old girl in a purple Easter dress who had understood that meaning to do something and doing it were two different things. She put the shoes on. They fit. There is a thing about kindness that Sophie Briggs could not have articulated at 8 years old and did not need to, because she demonstrated it more completely than most adults manage in a lifetime. It is this. The truest acts of kindness are not performed for an outcome. They are performed because the need is visible and the capacity exists, and the person doing them cannot imagine doing otherwise. The outcome, when it comes, is not the point. It is the evidence that the act was witnessed. Sophie did not write that letter expecting Cole Whitmore to read it. She wrote it because her grandmother could not walk to the creek, and her mother hummed hymns in the kitchen at midnight, and $17 was not enough. And she was 8 years old, and she was not going to sit still and do nothing. She wrote it because she drew a cardinal in the corner, and she wanted the letter to have something of Nora in it. She wrote it because it was true, and the truest things, sent into the world by the people most willing to offer them without guarantee of return, have a way of finding exactly the hands they were meant for. Cole Whitmore, 54 years old, the wealthiest private individual on the planet for the third consecutive year, sat at a kitchen table in Harlan County, Kentucky, on a June afternoon and ate a biscuit and listened to an old woman with clear brown eyes explain why sparrows were not boring. And something in him that had been navigating at altitude for a very long time came quietly down to earth. Not because he had done something generous. He had done something generous. But that was not what it was about. It was about a letter written in careful cursive on a piece of lined notebook paper with a cardinal in the corner. By a child who understood something it had taken him 54 years to almost understand, which was simply this: that the person across the table from you is always the point. Not the transaction, not the outcome, not the legacy, the person. He was still learning it. He expected he would spend the rest of his life learning it. He could not think of a better use of the time. Nora Briggs saw 3 more June gardens after that first one. She walked to the creek one afternoon in the summer. Sophie turned 10, slowly and with her cane, and with Sophie on one side and Cole on the other, and they looked at the water and the rocks and the kingfisher that sat on the low branch above the far bank. And Nora named it before anyone else had fully registered it was there. Belted kingfisher, she said. See the rufous on the sides. Female. Sophie got out her sketchbook. Cole watched the bird until it left. He thought about 200,000 employees in 40 countries and the particular efficiency with which he had spent 30 years moving toward problems before they became crises. He thought about all of it and about the kingfisher on the branch. And he concluded without particular drama that the creek was not a bad place to be. Diane finished her nursing degree in the spring. Sophie turned 11. She walked across the stage at the UK graduation ceremony in a robe that was slightly too large because she had ordered the wrong size and had not noticed until the morning, which she found funny in the specific way. You find things funny when you have been serious about them for so long that the absurdity of a detail becomes a gift. Nora and Sophie sat in the 4th row. Cole sat beside them. Sophie had made a sign. It read in the careful cursive she had perfected over 3 years. We always knew. She held it up when Diane's name was called. Diane saw it from the stage. She smiled the kind of smile that a person produces not for an occasion, but for a truth that has finally been allowed to be exactly what it is. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.